Hi and welcome back to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher. I'm an Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, how are you? We haven't seen each other for a while.
Hi Caroline. It is indeed quite a while, and many things have happened.
So look, yes, last time we spoke, we were face to face in the studio at the University of Canberra. This week, I'm talking to you from home via Zoom. You're in your office in the press gallery. What's it like? Is it fairly quiet in the press gallery?
Yes, it is quiet, and of course Parliament House overall is very quiet. There was a bit of activity yesterday when the politicians were back to pass that huge 130 billion stimulus package, not the stimulus package so much as a wage subsidy to keep companies in hibernation. But there was a reduced number of MPs here and they sat very far apart in the House of Representatives and the Senate. However, habits die hard, and Josh Frydenberg, for example, tried to shake Anthony Albanese's hand before he was reminded that life's not like that anymore. So the politicians seem to be going around bumping elbows, which seems a rather strange look, I must say, but that's the way it is.
So you're able to keep your metre and distance from your colleagues, in the corridors of the press gallery?
Well, that's right, because there aren't many here, and we're lucky we have quite a big office and only 3 people in it.
Okay, well look, let's go to Parliament this week. So it did sit on Tuesday, and as you mentioned, that massive, $130 billion wage subsidy package was passed. I mean, what impact will that have on the Australian economy's ability to manage this crisis? Will it make a decisive difference?
I think it will see quite a few businesses able to survive for some months, which in other circumstances probably wouldn't have been able to. Also, I think in terms of obviously individual workers, they stay attached to those businesses. They get more money than they would if they had to go onto unemployment benefits. And I think that at both an individual and a community level, the support provides some sort of psychological boost, and that's good at a time when people are really feeling pretty down about things.
Well, perhaps one of the unusual things that you're experiencing there is this sort of level of cooperation between the federal government and the state government, and the federal government and the federal opposition. Do you think it's going to last?
If we're talking about the next few weeks and months, I think that it will last, but we are seeing some modifications of it, of course. The National Cabinet, I think, has worked very well. However, there have clearly been differences among the various governments, and on some issues, the states, especially New South Wales and Victoria, have just gone their own way. They've wanted to go harder than the federal government, and they have done so. Now, in terms of the partisan debate at a Canberra level, Labor has supported the government in overall terms. It's backed the package that was passed this week, even though it had differences of detail and amendments, but it didn't push the case at all hard on those in terms of actual saying that it would try to obstruct the package. I think we are seeing a bit more debate now than we have in recent times. The Senate has set up a standing committee to look at the package, the measures that the government has taken overall, and that reports by June 30. We're not due to see the Parliament resume till August, but there is quite a lot of pressure to say that in fact it should come back before then. Whether that'll come to anything, who knows. But we are seeing a bit more ordinary debate, but very much muted debate.
What do you think of criticism that perhaps the Labor Party has been too critical? Do you think that's fair criticism?
No, I don't actually. I think that the Labor Party has been quite responsible. It's given general support to the government, which has been important, but it's also said on certain issues that the government should go earlier than in fact happened. But in many cases, the Labor Party's line, I think, has proved to be correct and measures have been taken up. But we don't want this crisis to suppress democracy. I think if it suppresses hyper-partisanship, that is a very good thing, and hopefully that will be a legacy out of it, although maybe that's too optimistic. But there's a difference between hyper-partisanship and normal political debate and questioning. It is important in these circumstances that we have accountability, and it's important that different views, whether they're on the health situation, the health response, or the economic response, that those different views be teased out and aired and the community hears them.
There might be some more debate around the phase out of restrictions and when to lift restrictions. There's a bit of debate emerging now about when that might happen and how that might happen. How soon do you think phasing out might begin?
Well, you're absolutely right that now, even though we're not very far into this crisis, people are talking about how do we get out of it? When do we get out of it? Surely we can have some restrictions removed in the near future. Well, I think we can't have them removed in the near future, but there is going to be a lot of pressure as weeks go on for us to start to come out of these restrictions. That's going to be very difficult. The Prime Minister has indicated that he thinks it would be too costly to go for a strategy of eliminating this virus, as they're trying to do in New Zealand. But the choice then becomes between trying to continue to suppress it, as is the current policy, and on the other hand, letting it move through the community, presumably in some more controlled way, the so-called herd immunity route. Now, I think that the herd immunity would be very controversial and would involve more deaths. So suppression, continued suppression does seem the most sensible course if that's viable, but that does mean you've got to be particularly careful in the removal of restrictions. Scott Morrison has suggested they could be lifted in some places, low risk places, states, for example, which would effectively be a trial for a wider lifting. But to do that, you've also got to be willing to put the controls back on if you see a rise in the number of cases. So it's going to be a very fraught path out of this crisis, and it's going to take a long time, and there'll be a lot of impatient ordinary people, but also business people and other sections of the community.
Yes, I mean, how well do you think the Australian community is coping with the stringent, measures that have been imposed on the community broadly?
I think that people have adjusted pretty well. Obviously, the police reaction in some places has been quite draconian, and we are aware of the loss of civil liberties and maybe arbitrary action. But at least the upside of that arbitrary action is that people's attention has been really focused on the situation and on what they need to do. And hopefully coming into Easter, they will remember and observe these restrictions, because it is a particularly important time. It's very difficult for people to be confined over the Easter days, but it is pretty important because so far we're doing quite well in health terms, obviously compared to a number of other countries where the picture has been horrendous, and it is crucial that we don't fall back at this stage.
So you mentioned New Zealand before and other countries. How do you think we're comparing our strategy in comparison to, say, New Zealand and the US?
Well, as I said, New Zealand is in complete lockdown, trying for total elimination, which is an ambitious policy, but they think that they're making fair progress at the moment. They've still got a way to go with that lockdown. Obviously, the US, the UK, countries in Europe have had a terrible time, and they're still having a terrible time. That's partly, I think, because of different circumstances, but also some policy differences. Australia had the advantage, of course, of being able to close its borders. There's an argument that even though it was very early out of the blocks on China, people coming from China, it would have been advantageous to close the borders more generally a bit earlier than we did. But nevertheless, that has been an effective measure, probably the most effective measure, and it's helped by the geography.
So overall, how well do you think that the federal government has been handling this issue? I mean, it's changing so constantly. How well have they managed to stay on top of it, do you think, in the last few weeks?
I think on balance, it's handled it well. I think on the economic side, as we mentioned, that support package is very, very important. And of course, it goes totally against Liberal ideology and has been criticised not so much within the Liberal Party, but by some of its supporters on the right. For example, the IPA has been very critical and argues really that the cure is worse than the disease in this circumstance. But I think that on the health side, it's also been good in its performance, basically good. There has been some chopping and changing, and there are critics of its approach. But if you were taking an overall assessment, I think so far it's done pretty well.
A lot of people say, oh, Australia's never going to be the same, that this experience is going to change Australia forever. What do you expect a post-virus Australia to look like? Do you think we'll be different?
I think we'll be washing our hands more for a very long time. But I think that in the medium term, no, Australia won't be the same, because the effects, especially the economic effects of this crisis, will last a long time. After all, the effects of the global financial crisis lasted quite a while, and I think this is turning out to be much worse than that because of the scale and the complications being both a health crisis and an economic one. Whether in 20, 30 years we'll say, well, we still see the implications and the effects, well, who knows? But certainly I think for the next decade, we'll see the effects. And of course, particularly because we'll have to pay off the debt that we're getting into to see us through the immediate term. So I don't think that the current politicians will be seeing surpluses anytime soon.
Okay, look, thanks, Michelle. I guess many of these questions we'll be revisiting over the coming weeks. Have a good Easter. As Sabra Lane said, be a good egg and stay at home. Speak to you next week.
Thanks, Caroline. Have a good Easter too, and see you next week.